Our next panel discussion is about another reality that's particularly impacting gay men. And I think there are some people here who've brought their children along, so I would say discretion is advised, as this could get a little bit adult. If I can have Robbie Travers and Iseult back to the stage, please. We're going to be talking about chemsex, love, and other drugs. This is something I know nothing about. Not really, because I'm more into, a nice cup of rose tea and a pack of biscuits, but once the pack opens, the whole pack goes, which is one of the reasons I stay well clear of all this stuff. But as a sobering fact that put things in perspective for me about this week, there was a probation officer in London who said that more people die, and particularly gay men, of chemsex related incidents than of gang-related violence. So that kind of puts it in perspective, doesn't it?
Yes, that does.
And on that note, I shall give you the mic and take it away.
I had been going to say that I just know about the love part. But then he sort of brought it down a notch. But it is a very, it is interesting to me how many people don't know about the chemsex scene. And it is quite a dark scene in many ways. So just to sort of keep that in mind as we're talking here. So we will also,
Yeah, I think it's important for people to realise that the culture that we're talking about is very adult. It is very dark in places, and the conversations we're going to have might make you feel deeply uncomfortable. And that's not because we want you to, but at the same time, the subject matter will, just by its very nature, make you feel uncomfortable. I was very lucky. I asked several people I know, could I use their stories anonymously? Because I've just heard them. Because if you're gay on the London scene, I'm afraid you're just going to hear these stories. And I'm very lucky that they all agreed. So I'll be telling you things that have actually happened. And if they shock you, I'm sorry, but also that's what's necessary. Because this is a life or death situation. People say that all the time, People say, oh, this is life or death. But people are dying. Gay men are dying. And actually, do you know what's even more alarming? Women are starting to die too, because the culture of gay men going to these parties isn't stopping at gay men going to these parties. It's transferring into other cultures and other demographics. And I think that should concern everybody as well, that this isn't just a limited phenomenon, but it's also a phenomenon that's really hard to deal with.
Yeah, and while we're talking about it, while it is dark, I also want to say it's important not to stigmatise gay male sexuality in talking about these things, so we're definitely not intending to do that at all either. So let's also, we should start explaining to these people, because they don't all know about chemsex, to be fair. Some, I can see some people do, but others not.
Careful
so
where you're
much.
pointing.
No, that was very wide.
You over there.
Did I meet you? And also to say, it is a very big thing in the Dublin scene as well. So
that's how we met. That's how we met, yeah.
Robbie and I go back a ways.
Back when she was a trans man.
Yeah, I pulled that one off well. Anyway, let's explain what chemsex is.
So to explain it, I think we have to go through three things very briefly. You have the afters and chills. Now, to many of you, you'll be going, what? And rightly so. After a night out in London, a lot of gay men end up in a flat, sometimes upward 200, 300, sometimes 400 in the biggest. Most of them are maybe wearing jock straps, hanging around, and they will be there from Saturday morning to Monday. And they will be taking massive amounts of drugs. They will have sexual partners of maybe 40, 50, 60. High numbers. And these go on every weekend. Every weekend. The drug levels are phenomenal. And we're not just talking about certain drugs. I was explaining to Iseult earlier, there's a drug called Chem-Sex, and it was used in porn early on. We're talking early porn in thousands, because Chem-Sex is for when Viagra stops working for men. So they're injecting it into the base of their penis, and it burns for 30 minutes. but it will physiologically keep them ready for sex for 6 hours. And they're doing that maybe 3-4 times. They're destroying their bodies. They're taking drugs. And the most worrying part is they're doing it for connection. And that's the really worrying part. You will hear repeatedly, and this is the sad thing, almost all research points towards these gay men going to parties where they're using highly dissociative drugs, looking for brotherhood, connection, friendship, community.
And intimacy.
Yes. They're looking for these things. But if you're taking dissociative drugs of such a high volume, the best way to liken it, I don't know, has anyone seen Severance in here, the TV show? Gay men are essentially severed. So for those who haven't seen it, to very, very briefly summarise without destroying the plot or what you haven't seen, people have a chip in their head and they go into work and they can't remember what they did at work, but they also can't remember their life outside when they're inside work. That's what these gay men are essentially doing. They're entering a chemical-induced lotus eater situation. A whole weekend of, I don't remember who I am, but I've been with 30, 40 people, and then when they're out of it, I had such a great time to escape my life. And it's escapism and a lack of intimacy and a lack of connection. And it's really worrying that that's what people are doing.
Yeah, and it's a collection of different types of drugs. It's drugs that make you dissociated. It's drugs that are analgesic, so stop you feeling pain, like ketamine, which is an animal tranquilizer. It's drugs that give you heightened sexual arousal and sort of feelings of ecstasy. So it's a whole cocktail of drugs combined towards keeping you going sexually, but also heightening your sexual arousal. And the whole thing is quite addictive. Not only are some of the drugs themselves addictive, but the process of when you're having sex on a high like that becomes what we call a process addiction. So it's an addiction to a pattern of behavior. And again, a lot of it is driven out of that seeking of connection and finding a place to call home in community.
And a lot of people are also coming from traumatized or abuse backgrounds. That's something to point out here. There's also, because of the proliferation of parasocial relationships, but also sexual sites like OnlyFans, for example, you have a mass proliferation of readily available sexual content. And that is vastly changing how young people see themselves. And one of the questions we also have to ask here is about coercion. I'm not going to name people because there's no point in that, and I don't believe in that. But if I was to tell you that most major organisations in London have people at chills, and young gay employees feel like they have to go to the chills to get ahead, to get a job, to get a promotion, that asks questions about coercion. Now, I'm not going to give you an easy answer because there isn't. How do you criminalise people having sex in that coercive nature? And that's something that we're going to have as a society, a wider discussion about coercion. What are the boundaries for coercion? But if you think about that in terms of men feeling... I actually spoke to someone who was a very, very young guy, and he ended up on, let's just say, a lot of ketamine in what's called a K-hole, which is when your mind is fully functioning in terms of perception, but your body is entirely paralysed. And he basically said, I felt like I couldn't do anything. It's just what happens with guys in London. I was used by half the party. And that was the way. I can't complain. I can't say anything because these people have power. They're an institute. I can't do anything. And I said, no, they're not your friends. Your friends don't rape you. That's the basis of it. But that's how young people feel. I can't say anything. I can't do anything. I have to be a part of this culture. How do you legislate that? It's a very hard problem. But at the same time, when you have people of prominence doing this, what level does it become coercive? At what level do you actually deal with this problem? And there's not easy solutions. That's part of the problem to this as well. And also, you can approach this without sounding like Mary Whitehouse, being like, ban this sick filth, that sort of thing, because a lot of the men you're trying to reach are deeply involved in this, or are involved in this and want to get out. It's a key kind of very narrow, tight walk that you're trying to walk across, essentially, with this kind of narrow wire, because you don't want to come across puritanical, but at the same time you actually want to help and have some form of ability to reach out to these very vulnerable men. And some of them will go to parties week after week after week after week after week after week after week. There's a party on every weekend. There's parties on everywhere. And that is just part of the London gay scene, and it's a tough thing to do.
And very much part of the Dublin gay scene as well. And I suppose in terms of the culture doesn't see itself as a as so much of a, now we say substance use disorder now rather than addiction in the field. But this culture sees itself as separate from the main substance abuse or substance use disorder culture and tends to have different names for things. So slamming is what they will call injecting, and they'll call needles pins. They don't have a culture internally of harm reduction, of using clean needles. And it's taken some time for the addiction organizations or the organizations that support people who use drugs to provide programs for people coming from chemsex. But also in terms of the hospitals, you know, some of these drugs they're not so commonly used except internally within the chemsex scene. And so maybe the medical professionals aren't as aware of the drug patterns that are being used. And don't necessarily know how to address it. And some of the drugs don't come up in standard or they're not standardly screened for toxicology-wise. So there's a whole cultural shift and administrative shift that has to happen to support this. But it's about a way of offering men, and the category we call this in research is MSM, men who have sex with men, for offering men who have sex with men better education on the issues around this and how to do the harm reduction in a non-stigmatizing way. But also I think, you know, there's something that this really reminds me of, how little people know about this and that so many gay men are dying. And when I first came out and I was living in San Francisco in the early 90s, it was a time when AIDS hit my age group of young men, and young men were dying. And I feel like there's something spiritually here for young men who are attracted to men, finding a home for themselves where they can actually have intimacy and have more normal, you know, well, I don't want to say normal's the wrong thing because that's stigmatizing, but like there's something missing here.
Yeah, it's a cultural pendulum swinging back and forth, and it's swung one way and now it's going back the other. And I think part of the issue here is we have to have a discussion about PrEP. Now, PrEP is a drug that is life-saving. It prevents, you know, contraction of HIV in young gay men. Well, anyone who takes it, because they also give it to other people who are, according to having risky sex or high risk of transmission of HIV. One of the things in the gay community is, yes, it has obviously massively lowered the spread of and contraction of HIV, which is a great thing. We should celebrate that. That's a good thing. However, it's also led to a lot of people feeling invincible, and I do think this needs to be discussed about the potential effects of the spread of other STIs. Gonorrhea is becoming incredibly antibiotic resistant. We have other serious forms of sexual infection. Syphilis is on a massive rise. In the UK, I think it is also in Ireland. You also have other forms of infection. You need to have a discussion as well about if you're having, and this is just on a pure logistical risk-based term, if you're having a large number of sex with a large number of partners, what is the medical reality of that? And that's not, you know, shaming people. That's just asking basic questions about what is the effect on that on antibiotic transmission, because the number of infections will increase. The number of partners has massively increased, so will infections. And that's part of the problem. You have to deal with that. I think, go on.
Well, and also with unclean needles, then HPV or hepatitis as well as HIV being transmitted, as well as the high rates of gonorrhea. And then the other health issue is abscesses developing from using unclean needles as well. So people with, you know, quite complex abscesses from drug use, injecting.
And I think it's also as well about escalation. So just as drugs become more and more and more and more extreme for the people constantly taking them at such a high frequency and a volume addictively, the sexual practices also become much more extreme. Now, that leads to problems, and one of the problems is that leads from basically behaviours that start in the gay male community end up in porn with women. That's just the sad reality of things, and I think that has to be discussed. You know, what you're seeing at these channels, and don't worry, I'll spare your blushes, I will not name the practices, but these practices are eventually becoming more common amongst heterosexual partners as that changes, because essentially what happens at a chill ends up in an OnlyFans video. The OnlyFans creators end up seeing it are women, and some, you know, to name a name, Bonnie Blue, for example. Bonnie Blue is a product of chill culture. Bonnie Blue has looked at that, she's seen it and gone, I think I can use this. And then that effect is on hundreds of young boys watching that. And I'm just going to be honest, they are watching it. You know, we can say that it's wrong that they watch it, but they are watching it. That's the reality. They're seeing that, and that is affecting the expectations of young girls. This is not something that's distinct or separate. It is an entire cycle. And unless we deal with that whole cycle holistically and have a societal discussion about it, I think we could end up in a very dangerous place. And one of the things that is coming through as well is young women are starting to die at these parties. Young women. That's a total shift in demographic, and it's a concern. But I also think one thing we also need to talk about is parents in a situation where a lot of these young men are dying. They're young gay men, and they're dying from extreme amounts of drugs. I know several who have unfortunately passed, and their parents have said, we don't want any discussion about this.
Well, there's a wonderful example of that. The Vivienne, who's a drag queen who ran the first drag race, his family says he died from cardiac arrest due to ketamine. Now, of course, ketamine is one of the key chemsex drugs, but I'm pretty sure the Vivienne was intimately involved in the chemsex scene, and this is poly drug abuse that led to the Vivienne's death. But that's if you look at the media narrative around the Vivienne's death and the sort of the celebration of her life. I did put big quotes around that. But that's hiding a real darkness underneath. And the pushing of the drag scene as this super happy clappy scene, when underneath many of these things there is real shadow and darkness.
And I think as well it comes back to the fact that there's this idea that the culture you consume does not affect you. And I think that's very wrong. Culture that you consume does affect you. That's why you see so many trans drag queens now, because all the queens on RuPaul's Drag Race, the more they put on, the more they immerse themselves in the scene, end up becoming trans. It's a very similar thing with this. The more you expose yourself to it, you are what you eat, but that's also in a cultural sense too. And
that culture has moved over to girls who call themselves drag queens now, meaning as themselves as male drag queens.
It's drag kings, actually.
No. I'm not talking about drag kings.
I
was all over the drag kings.
Steady on. Keep it PG.
Back in the day, but we'll talk about that later. But no, there's a whole scene of young women who maybe start off identifying as non-binary, but not in a particularly non-gendered, agender way, and then move into sort of calling themselves drag queens and performing as drag queens and getting involved in these kind of scenes as well.
And I think one of the interesting things, though, to bring up is I've spoken to a lot of people who do this because it's important. You know, you can't just write them off. You have to understand the picture on the ground. And one of the most interesting things is it's a place where gender ideology doesn't thrive. Because at a chill, everyone knows what a man is. There's hundreds of them there. And there's a really unfortunate meme online. It's quite cruel, but I think it is actually important for people to know this. And the meme online has all these kind of very fit, buff men in jock straps going around. And then there's just a very sad trans-identified female, so a woman in the corner, being like, will anyone sleep with me? Anyone? And I think one of the things that we need to add in here is putting women into these situations where there's incredibly rough sex, incredibly rough drug abuse, is very dangerous and very damaging. Not that they're actually included, but the fact that there's suggestions that they should want to be, that they should be there, that's quite damaging for these young women. But also selling them the lie that they'll want to be an object of a gay man's affection or desire in a moment is actually placing them in danger, because we all know gay men, and I'll tell you, the gay men at these chills are usually 6 foot, built like Greek gods. And you've got this young woman there, and she's probably hiding her genitals because that's what they were taught. There was do you remember that document that went out in the NHS in England telling you when they went into saunas, etc., please hide your genitals when interacting with men to protect yourselves. So engage in sex by deception. But you have that sort of thing. And the idea that these very, very, very intoxicated men are not going to have an adverse reaction is actually putting the lives of these vulnerable young women at risk. I think it's deeply irresponsible, and I think the people promoting it do need to have a serious look at themselves.
Absolutely, but I agree with you fully, but I also want to speak up for the sexual trauma to young men and older men, because that's one of the things that probably we don't always talk enough about, is how many men who have sex with men have experienced rape and sexual trauma. And it can be very hard for men who have sex with men when seeking services for having experienced sexual trauma. And there is a lot of sexual trauma from the chemsex parties. There's a lot of non-consensual sex when you're really out of it, lots of injuries. And this is very much part of the scene as well. And we tend as a culture to not talk about the trauma of gay men and the sexual trauma that they experience. And this is very much part of the scene.
I also think as well that people don't want to talk about this. So I'll tell you now, I said this to Iseult. I had about 50 messages saying, don't touch this. Don't talk about this. Don't deal with this. Please don't talk about this. And I thought, well, actually, do you know what? I didn't no debate the trans stuff. So I'm not going to no debate this. I'm not going to not discuss it. Because also, when you have this whole pressure around don't discuss this, it's icky, it makes us uncomfortable. It leads to a situation where we can't have the discussion for the very vulnerable people, because there are people who feel locked into this and they don't feel that they have a way out. Who is going to try and talk to them? And this isn't about cracking the whip and calling them all sorts of names. Okay, don't get excited.
Sorry, the Glenn Greenwald video just came into my head.
I think we've got trauma here as well. But anyway, this whole situation has to be dealt with that sensitivity of we are dealing with people's lives, and we're dealing with men who need to be, communicated with rather than against. Because at the end of the day, they're not going to listen. And this is actually something I will say. It's not on women to have this conversation. And not that you don't do brilliantly and not that you're fabulous, but this is the responsibility of gay men, and particularly to start speaking up, standing up and talking. Because it's a issue that's primarily affecting gay men. Gay men need to start having that discussion, and they can't just sweep it under the carpet. Because unfortunately, the more bodies there are, they won't fit. And that's a harsh image, but it's a true image. And I think it's a really harsh thing to say. But we need to have the discussion, and gay men need to be put in tune with the discussion. And actually, I think it's for the best that they do have that discussion, because if we don't have it, we're going to end up in a very dark place yet again.
And just before we close, there is a great programme called Empower here in Ireland, and it's called the Club Drugs Clinic, that's run by Merchants Quay. So there are resources out there, so if anybody's affected, please do find those resources.
Thank you. We can take a question or two. I just want to counter one of the things that you said, as in this is something specifically obviously affecting gay men, but I also know of some women that have been sucked into this who believe themselves to be men. And they're obviously gay men themselves are at risk, physically, emotionally. Women's bodies are made very differently from men's bodies. So gay men can engage in certain things that are harder for a woman to engage in and more damaging, and especially if they're on testosterone. For example, the vaginal lining thins, and when they're having unprotected sex, it's much easier to catch HIV.
Yeah, and without being too graphic, women's bodies are not in the same way capable of sustaining anal sex for prolonged periods of time as well. So it does have that effect. You're right, Menno.
There was a woman at Let Women Speak in London last month or the month before, and she did a short talk about how the female arsehole, as she put it, is made very differently from the male one. And these are, again, things that we need to be aware of. Questions? I'll take one from you.
Thanks. Can you hear me all right? Yeah? Sorry, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So, sorry, I haven't got this quite straight in my head, but there's a lot of books gone into schools, like This Book is Gay and all this, that apparently talk a lot about gay sex. I haven't read them, but I hear about them. So, and so that's, what am I trying to say? Like, how do you start those conversations with young boys without these books that may not be appropriate being in the libraries? And, you know, I think a lot of us probably in the room here object to the early sexualization of kids and them being given inappropriate information at the wrong ages. But it sounds to me very much like boys who think they're gay also need to be educated at some point. So how do you find that balance? And also, it sounds like they need positive male role models who are older, but at the same time, we don't want the situation of the 14-year-old boys in the room with the 30-year-old men. So it seems like, how do you have those conversations and get the right information to teenage boys, I suppose, in particular, who might be coming to terms with their sexuality? How do you find that balance?
I think that's a great question, and it's not an easy one to answer. But I think as parents or teachers or psychotherapists or whatever your role is with regard to young people, is that you do need to educate yourself so that you understand that this is part of this life, right? Or for some people. And to be able to have quite frank discussions. I love my gay male friends, but it's quite an intense scene to launch yourself onto. So yes, absolutely support your young gay son, but be able to try and have open and frank discussions that are non-judgmental is the only thing that I can think of, really, and point them to resources so that they can find help for themselves. That's all I can offer here. I'm not sure if that's enough.
I think the thing we also need to talk about is the total lack of role models. And I don't mean total, I mean a significant lack of role models amongst the elder gay scene, because HIV/AIDS had an effect. And it took out so many gay men from your generation. And so many younger gay men don't have that to look up to. Because there's celebrity role models that you can always have. But there's also role models in your community, role models in a wider sense. And I think these young gay men miss that to an extent, and having that is so important. And the devastation that we've felt from that is a shockwave. It's not just something that continuously is limited to that time period. But in terms of, what you're saying about being accurate, I think you have to do both an anti-drugs message when kids are younger, but you also have to do a very basic boundaries education on sexuality. So you don't have to teach children about things, but you have to teach children about boundaries. I am uncomfortable with this, please stop. You could also do I would say a basic anatomy level. You wanted to go on this, go.
As well as boundaries, and it's really important, you also have to talk frankly to young people about how strong feelings of desire are. So we tend to have these messages that like, oh, protect yourself, but like, I don't know how many of you remember back to adolescence and early adulthood, and you're like, oh my God, those feelings that come in. So you have to talk to young people about how much desire hits them, and how, when desire hits, how are they going to decide what's the right thing for them then? So it's no good talking about these things in sort of calm isolation. You have to talk about when everything is heightened, when you're out with friends. How are you going to give yourself an excuse to get out of this situation without losing social status? So these are the kind of skills we have to educate young people with.
Yes.
One last thing for Menno. I just want to say that the fact that we have to have this conversation downstairs in a basement, where we have to search people's bags, where we have to be careful about who can enter and exit, where we can't publicly advertise a conference venue, when people are dying and that's all we want to talk about, and it's for everything going to this conference, is a disgrace. And it's nothing on the organisers or the hotel who've been brilliant. It is on the fact that we can't have this conversation without threat of feeling attacked, under risk, or being seriously harmed, or attendees not being able or having a disruption. What does that say about our society, that young gay people and our allies and friends can't get together and have that conversation? And I think it's something we want to finish on.
But what they can get is obviously a party this weekend.
Yeah.
I mean, but because they don't see the alternative, I guess. And when I look at this, I think there's a much bigger issue, which is a much harder one to tackle, which is generally men, how we look for connection with other men, and how male sexuality can derail that so easily, in terms of the need to get off, if you like. Because so many guys are like, I'm bored, sex. I'm angry, sex. I'm horny, sex. And it always makes me wonder, like, this is going to sound really cheesy. You need to get to a point in life where you accept yourself as you are and you love yourself as you are. And that's a whole journey in itself. Yes. And here, there's an option that says, oh, you don't have to bother with that, escape. Yeah. And a word that you mentioned earlier was connection. So isn't it ironic that so many guys are caught up in this? They're looking for connection, and all they do is end up losing. They lose themselves, they lose their jobs, they lose their homes, they lose their careers, and they lose themselves. Yeah. And it's the saddest thing. Yeah, that's a really good note to end on. But guys need to learn how to connect with each other, I think, emotionally. You're in the house, so I just want to point out something you organized. This is Ant. He organized a weekend over Easter for gay men, just to go together and go for a walk. And it was a walk where you weren't allowed to bring your phone, which felt very oppressive, I have to say. But it was good, because it's about you just walk through what we didn't even follow. We followed a path, but it wasn't an official path. We followed an underground river, right? And we met alpacas on the way, and a sheep giving birth, and her name was Barbara.
You touched grass, literally.
We touched grass. So it's about how you connect with other. Go on.
That wasn't what I was going to say something else. But those places have the places that gay men made. By gay men for gay men have been essentially garroted by genderism, either by the gays who just want to give up their boundaries, or if you basically have to put up or shut up. So this weekend over Easter was the first men-only gay men's gathering that I've been to that wasn't insane since 2018. So it's 7 years is a long time. The mental health sort of impact of being shunned, particularly over lockdown, was. I mean, you were witness part of that as well. How we were the connections that we'd made worldwide had been erased because we didn't see the vagina as a male organ.
Right. There's a song I'm writing about that.
There's a repeat in September for gay men, and there's a somewhat more mixed thing happening at the end of July, which coincides with Glastonbury Pride.
And you can tell them all about that during the coffee break, which is now. So if I can have you back in 15 minutes, that'd be awesome. Thank you.